Anyway, I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 31 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sur la forme hybride, conformément à l'ordre.
Today's meeting is in hybrid form, pursuant to order made in the House on January 21st. Members are either here in person or through the Zoom application. Proceedings will be published on the House of Commons website. For your information, the website will always show the person speaking rather than the entire committee.
Participating virtually, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Please let me know if at any time interpretation is lost. All right, so we want to make sure that's working well, and so that everyone can fully participate in the proceedings. So for members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Please wait until I recognize you by name before you start to speak. And please, and once again, I'm saying that to remind myself as much as anyone else, please speak slowly. I'm winking at the interpreter, so she knows I'm getting it. Slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. Okay, we will do our best. Oh, we still need the, yes, okay, they're working on it. Trying to keep track of who wants to talk when is much easier if it's done virtually via the Zoom application. It helps us a lot keep track of things, so they're fixing that right now because it's not up at the present time. All right, okay, so pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request for additional witnesses for the study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. I will now open the floor for debate. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank colleagues for meeting during this constituency week to consider a new motion to look at more witnesses to dive in deeper into what actually has happened in the sexual misconduct allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance, Chief of Defence Staff Admiral Art MacDonald, and others as this has evolved over the past 100 days. So, Madam Chair, I'd like to move the following motion, which has been circulated by the clerk about 20 minutes ago. So I take it that all members of the committee have a copy in front of them. And it reads, that in respect of the committee's study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance, A, recalling that Zita Estravis, former Chief of Staff to the Minister of National Defence, was invited on Monday, March the 8th, 2021 to appear before the committee within 14 days, and was ordered by the House of Commons on Thursday, March 25th, 2021 to appear before the committee on Tuesday, April 6th, 2021, and did not appear on either occasion. The committee issued a summons for Zita Estravis to appear before this committee at a televised meeting at a date and time determined by the chair, which is no later than Friday, May the 21st, 2021, or 2 days following the adoption of this motion, until she is released by the committee, provided that in the event Zita Estravis defaults on the summons, 1, the clerk and analysts be directed to prepare a brief report to the House outlining the material facts of the possible contempt the situation would represent, to be considered by the committee in public at its first meeting after the consideration of the main report on the study has been completed, and 2, the Minister of National Defence and Gary Walborn, former National Defence and Canadian Forces Ombudsman, be invited to appear jointly on a panel for 2 hours at a televised meeting no later than Thursday, May 27th, 2021. Part B, the study be expanded to include matters related to the allegations against Major General Denny Fortin, lately Vice President Logistics and Operations of the Public Health Agency of Canada, which has recently come to light, with a view to addressing these matters in the report referred to in paragraph C, or if that is not practically feasible, in a further report to be tabled before the House begins its summer adjournment. And to this end, the committee invite representatives of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Privy Council Office, and the Public Health Agency of Canada to appear as soon as possible to discuss these matters. And Part C, the provisions of the motion adopted on Monday, April 12th, 2021, concerning a report to the House be supplemented as follows. 1, notwithstanding the motion adopted on Monday, April 12th, 2021, drafting instructions and recommendations arising from the evidence received by the committee after Friday, April 16th, 2021, may be sent to the clerk, A, in respect of evidence received from the adoption of this motion within 24 hours of the adoption of this motion, or B, in respect of evidence received as a consequence of paragraphs A or B within 24 hours of the adjournment of the meeting where the evidence was received. 2, until Friday, May 28, 2021, the committee hold at least one meeting per week to receive evidence related to the study, and at least one meeting per week to consider the draft report. 3, at 2:45 p.m. on Friday, May 28, 2021, or if the committee is not then sitting immediately after the committee is next called to order, the proceedings before the committee shall be interrupted, if required for the purposes of the motion adopted on Monday, April 12, 2021, and every question necessary for the disposal of the draft report, including on each proposed recommendation which has not been disposed of, shall be put forthwith and successively without further debate or amendment. 4, the committee declines to request pursuant to Standing Order 109 that the government table a comprehensive response to the report. And 5, dissenting or supplementary opinions or recommendations shall be filled pursuant to Standing Order 1081B in both official languages no later than 4 p.m. on Friday, June 4th, 2021. Madam Chair, I'd like to speak to the motion.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, as we know from
Wait a
testimony...
minute. Stand by for a minute. How long are you going to speak?
5 minutes or so.
Because other people will want to make sure they have time to study it, and maybe they'd be in a position to ask you questions. So as long as you're prepared to accept questions afterwards, I think that would be fine.
Okay, let me lay out the rationale behind the rather in-depth and substantive motion.
It is very, yes.
So as we all know, we have invited Zita Estravis to come to our committee. We know that we have had an order from the House of Commons to have her appear at this committee, and she has failed to appear on either of those occasions. We know that from testimony that we've received from Elder Marquez, from Minister Sajjan, from Katie Telford and Michael Warnick and Janine Sherman, that nobody seems to know how the concerns that were raised by Zita Estravis on the allegations of sexual misconduct and evidence that was presented by Gary Walborn to Minister Sajjan was received in the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office. Mr. Marquez said that he was notified to look into the matter by Katie Telford. Katie Telford said that she believed that she was told by Elder Marquez about the allegations against General Vance. And we have Michael Warnick, who said it came from the Prime Minister's office that he was contacted. The only person that could shed light of how the information flowed is Zita Estravis. We need her to appear to answer the questions related around who she phoned, who she talked to, how many times she talked to different people within the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office. We also have the claim made by Katie Telford at the meeting she testified at, that she knew that the allegations were not a safety concern. Who told her it was not a safety concern? And I believe that Zita Estravis, who received firsthand information from Minister Sajjan, would be in the best position to answer that question, how they knew that this wasn't a safety concern, and also how these allegations became reported as sexual harassment within all official documentation that flowed from the Prime Minister's office to the Privy Council office. Now, if Ms. Estravis refuses to appear, I think that is an issue that needs to be considered as potential contempt of Parliament. I also believe that if she's unprepared to appear, or if the government decides that ministers will appear on behalf of political staff, then I think it's only right then that the Minister of National Defense, Harjit Sajjan, will appear alongside the former military ombudsman Gary Walborn, so that we can get down to the facts instead of having, I said this and he said that. We need to have both witnesses sitting as a panel in front of this committee no later than May the 27th, if we cannot have Zita Estravis appear. The allegations that came to light on Friday, interesting at the end of sitting week and before we have a break week for the House of Commons, there is these allegations against Major General Danny Fortin, who has been seconded over to the Public Health Agency of Canada. Canadian Armed Forces, no question, has been rocked by all these allegations of sexual misconduct. There is now concern that government actually knew about this for weeks, as Prime Minister Trudeau said in his presser this morning, that he was aware of these allegations, that he didn't do anything with them for several weeks. And Canadians, again, need to know how that information flowed. Why did it take so long to have General Fortin step aside while this investigation is ongoing? Major General Fortin is saying that he just learned of these allegations when media approached him on it last week. So Prime Minister was aware several weeks ago. Are we looking at another cover-up of sexual misconduct allegations in the Canadian Armed Forces that is being actually compounded by the Prime Minister and his staff themselves? So we need to drill down, and that's what paragraph B is about. And then paragraph C ensures that this committee does get to having a report tabled in the House before summer break. And essentially, if we can still hear from witnesses that this motion calls to hear at least one meeting a week, and then have one meeting a week dedicated to consideration of the draft report and making it additions to it as required based upon new testimony that we hear. The purpose here is to ensure that by the end of business on Friday, May the 28th, that we will then proceed to the approval of all outstanding paragraphs and recommendations in that report by a simple roll call vote. We'll go paragraph by paragraph, recommendation by recommendation, if it's required, because the committee has been stalled on discussing elements of the report or on the recommendations themselves. So, Madam Chair, this essentially is an autopilot motion to ensure that we get to the final end of this, that the report will be tabled, that it does provide the provision of, I guess, minority reporting or supplemental opinion if, one or more of the parties sitting around this table are not comfortable with all of the recommendations and different paragraphs and language within the report. So I think that it's fairly straightforward, although this is a fairly lengthy motion. It's clear to see from everyone that this is about getting down to who knew what when, bringing clarity to the conflicting testimony that we've heard from numerous witnesses, including the Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan, Katie Telford, the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Trudeau, Elder Marquis is the former Senior Advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau, and officials in the Privy Council office. I'm done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. To Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to react to the motion tabled by my colleague. I find it very interesting. Of course, you will understand that I've often said that it's important for this committee to end up with a report on the work we do. I think this is important work that deserves a report. It has to be shown that we have tried to find ways to summons witnesses such as Ms. Estravis. It's necessary that she appear before the committee so that we have her views on various versions of events we hear before the committee. So it would be important to have that before a final report so that we have the means to do so. So I find this interesting. Now, maybe it's a question of wording here, the way this is written, but something needs clarification to my mind. Perhaps Mr. Bazan can elucidate. Is the desire to have a final report or a preliminary report? Because I get the impression that there's a risk here that there'll be an issue about that, since we will have seen witnesses within a short time. We may not have time to make changes because the analysts will not be able to do these adjustments with the information we get. So I think it's important to clarify that. So there's also the question of the beginning of an investigation around Mr. Fortin. That is very uncomfortable to my mind. I won't hide the fact that for the time being, this doesn't seem to be somebody who abused anybody. We don't have much information, so we don't want to have some kind of kangaroo court. We have to look at this. I find it difficult from my side to support this part of the proposal. But as far as the rest is concerned, I'm eager to get clarification from Zita Astravas. If ever we can't, at least we should be able to confront the different versions by the ombudsman and that by Mr. Sajjan, because something's not right here. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Did that not go? Mr. Garrison?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Sorry, there's some kind of glitch there. I didn't hear you call on me. So I am happy to support this motion as it's been submitted. I think we have a critical issue before us, and that is the study we've embarked on is about how the complaint against General Vance as the former Chief of Defence Staff and the highest placed Canadian military officer was handled. And if we're to move forward on the serious crisis we have of sexual misconduct in the military, which includes those, and I would have to say a large number of those at the very highest levels, it's important to restore the trust that those at the highest levels, both within the military and politically, both understand and will take action on sexual misconduct allegations. And to me, that's a fundamental part of what we've been doing in this study. And so I believe that Ms. Astravas is the one who can answer the question, which is still outstanding before us, is who made the decision not to investigate the allegations against General Vance? And if there was no decision, then does this indicate that people didn't really understand the seriousness of sexual misconduct within the Canadian military? And the answer to that question, either one of those answers, will be critical to confidence among the rank and file serving members and the Canadian public in any reforms that are suggested going forward. And so for that reason, as I said, I am supportive. Expanding to include how the allegations against General Fortin were handled, I could support. I could also support the motion without Section B in it. I will have to say that I'm disappointed that the government rebuffed offers from myself and other opposition members to set aside this most contentious report and to finish the 2 draft reports that we have before us on studies that we began before this study. On COVID-19.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Madame
I believe that
Vanderbilt.
what he's referring to happened in camera, and there were some other things in camera that I wouldn't mind saying about what Mr. Garrison tried to eliminate from the report, but I won't do that because that would be out of order because that was an in-camera meeting.
Thank you, Madame Vanderbilt. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Well, Madame Vanderbilt has just violated the in-camera privilege that she cites. I will say very directly that she spoke to me about this outside of formal meetings. We've several times spoken about setting this aside to move on to the other important reports. So Ms. Vanderbilt can violate the sanctity of the meeting if she likes,
Okay, this is not
This
helpful.
offer was made several times.
All right, this is not helpful. All right, this is a substantive motion on the floor, and as per our normal practice, we're going to suspend for a few minutes till everyone has a chance to read it, so they could possibly come up with amendments that might make it acceptable.
Point of order, Madam
Suspended.
Chair. Absolutely outrageous.
All right, I think you had the floor, Mr. Garrison. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to return to where I was speaking when the meeting was arbitrarily suspended. And what I was saying is that this motion doesn't deal with the problem that we have two outstanding reports for studies that began before this study of sexual misconduct, on which we've made a great deal of progress as a committee, and which we were dealing with at draft stage, as was published on the committee website earlier. And one of those is the COVID report. And I really think that there are important recommendations there. We're not out of this pandemic yet. We could face further repercussions, further waves. And I think it's very important that this report get tabled in the House of Commons to provide that advice. The second report is on mental health in the Canadian Forces. And this is an issue I've been raising in two parliaments now, both the specific issue that self-harm remains a disciplinary offense in the military code of conduct, and the more general lack of services for those in the Canadian Forces facing mental health challenges. So we still continue to lose one serving member a month to death by suicide. So we have a real crisis here that needs to be dealt with. And we had very important testimony with very important suggestions on what might be able to happen. And we have a draft report. And at one point, our agenda very clearly and publicly said that we would deal with the draft report on COVID, and then we would deal with the mental health report. Unfortunately, at the next meeting, the chair arbitrarily changed the order of business to deal with the sexual misconduct report. And I am going to once again express my disappointment that the government has rebuffed all offers to deal expeditiously with these two important reports, and instead appears to be holding these reports hostage to getting their way on the sexual misconduct report. And obviously, the sexual misconduct report is much more difficult for us to make progress on because we have two different conceptions of what the question is. And I think that Mr. Bazan's motion helps us get at the essence of what the question before us really is. Why was there no action taken on allegations of sexual misconduct against General Vance in 2018? Why was he allowed to stay for another 3 years in charge of Operation Honor? So if someone made that decision, we need to know who that was, and we still have contradictory testimony about that. If no decision was made, that raises an even larger problem of whether the Minister of Defense in particular, or the Prime Minister's office, actually understood the severity of the crisis of sexual misconduct in the Canadian military. And as I've said repeatedly, until we answer those questions, any reforms going forward will be taken less seriously than they should be by perpetrators, and they won't have the full confidence of those who are survivors of sexual misconduct. So I am in support of this motion. As I said, with or without Section B, I would be prepared to vote in favor of the motion. But I do regret that the important work on COVID and the Canadian Forces and on mental health in the Canadian Forces is being held hostage by the government to try and force some concessions from the opposition on the sexual misconduct study. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Garrison. On to Monsieur Barcelou-Duval and then Madame Vanderbilt. Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval? Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier, I spoke to the motion. I said that there were many parts of it that I thought were very important. For instance, summoning Ms. Astravas so that we could have a report. I would be uncomfortable having a report without being able to obtain the information which I feel is in her hands. That's what I understand anyway, because given the contradictory information that we've seen from different sides, it seems to me that her presence could clarify a lot of things, and her testimony too, and the questions we could put to her. So that's why I insist that she be with us, because it's very frustrating to see how much time we've wasted at this committee. And there have been times where there were versions that changed over time. So having different versions and contradictory versions makes it difficult for us to do our job properly. So it justifies this person's presence. The reason why I wanted to speak a second time is because I would like to make an amendment. I expressed my intention about it earlier, but I didn't do it formally. I simply wanted to delete point B. The study we were to undertake about Major General Denis Fortin. I'm quite comfortable with the rest of the motion in its current form. So that's the amendment I would suggest, Madam Chair.
All right, so the debate is now on the amendment. Did you want to go? So an amendment was put forward to remove section B? Am I correct?
Yeah, my comments were in general. So
Would you like to come back afterwards?
sure.
Okay, all right. So then it's Mr. Bazan and then Mr. Spengeman.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I had my hand up for a while because I want to respond to some of the questions that our colleague, Mr. Barcelo Devel, had earlier. And I just want to, again, make sure committee understood that Section B is about the new allegations that have come forward on General Fortin. And so we aren't creating, we don't want to at all dive into the allegations themselves. And although this seems very fresh, we have moved quickly as committee on all of the allegations against former generals and admirals as they become public. And, it's interesting to note that, all the action by the government doesn't take place until after media outlets starts reporting on a sexual allegation or allegation of sexual misconduct against one of our commanders. And so if you actually look at the way things have played out, February 2nd is when Global News broke the story on General Vance. Then we had the headline on February 8th about Minister Sagen not having acted upon it from 3 years ago. February 9th, this committee then had an emergency meeting and we brought forward the motion that to start the study into sexual misconduct allegations against the former Chief of Defense Staff. On February 24th, news breaks about sexual misconduct allegations against Chief of Defense Staff Admiral McDonald. We moved as committee, and by March the 8th, we already had a motion to expand the scope of our study. So it was having us look at the allegations against General Fortin, not the allegations, but against how this information has been handled, is germane to the overall study. And again, we have allegations that broke in the news media that General Fortin wasn't even aware of last Friday, and that Prime Minister Trudeau, in a press conference this morning, said he was aware of this several weeks ago. And of course, it only became public after media sources started to report. So, Madam Chair, and to my colleagues, it is important that we look into how the flow of information is being handled, why there is this lack of transparency. If we have commanding officers that are continuing being implicated in sexual misconduct allegations, why are they allowed to stay in command posts as long as they have until we actually get to the point in time that their due process has been completely fulfilled for both the complainant and the commanding officers? So we should be drilling down into this, and on the report side, I'm not suggesting at all that we slow down the report. That's why Part C is here, to make sure that we have a timeline, that we have an autopilot in the case that we can't come to decisions through constructive debate and working together on the draft report, that we do get to the point of just voting on each paragraph and on each recommendation as we go forward after the end of the month. If the Fortin part of the study yields some extra information on how information flows from Canadian Armed Forces into the Minister of National Defense and up into the Prime Minister's office, then that, if we can include it before the deadlines that are laid out in this motion, then we can deal with it and include it as a separate paragraph or two. Or if it is impossible, because it actually creates more questions than answers, we would then have a supplemental report just on this part of the motion, on Part B. So it's about making sure that we can address the full scope of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces as it's impacting upon our highest ranking officers.
Thank you, Mr. Bizan. Madame Vandenbelt, and then, okay, that changed. Mr.
No, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I, in terms of the amendment, I think that would remove just one of the problematic pieces of this particular motion. So, of course, we would be supportive of that because in this country we do have due process, and we do want to ensure that people are not tried in the court of public opinion. I think that is incredibly important, not only for the person who stands accused, but also for those people for the survivors, for the people who are impacted by that behavior. It is, I think, very important that we allow that due process. And so I would support the amendment. However, there are significant issues, both procedural and content in this motion, and frankly in the tone of the debate that we have started seeing here today. First of all, a motion that is this comprehensive, once again being table dropped minutes before the meeting begins, without any courtesy for other members of the committee to be able to, especially in an area where we're mostly by Zoom, and so we're not sitting side by side with our colleagues as we normally are, and we can look to each other and what do you think of this and what do you think of that. I mean, we are at a distance. It makes it more difficult also to be able to look at the other side and come to agreements on things, but even more so when something is table dropped just before a meeting starts, when we have to start speaking on it minutes after the first time that we read it. And that's fine if it's a sentence that you want to change in a motion, but a motion that's I don't know how many paragraphs long is very unfair. And this has been a habit throughout the last number of weeks and months. And having said that, I think that there's some very inflammatory language being used here. The idea that anybody would hold a report hostage, I truly don't know where that is coming from. I know that there have been many meetings set aside over the last few months in order to look at those draft reports. Some of them where opposition members decided that they were going to go out of camera and start a motion as opposed to actually looking at the draft reports. This is something that's gone on for 3 or 4 months. I think there have been many attempts to try to make sure that we do get those reports out. And frankly, I think we still would very much like to see all of the reports. We had a motion that was passed in the committee that required that we would consider the sexual misconduct report before a certain date. And I think to allude that the chair is doing things unilaterally is very unfair when all that the chair is doing is following the motion that was actually adopted by this committee with a particular timeline. And having said that about the timeline, Madam Chair, I feel as though each time we get to a point where we say, okay, we're going to make sure that we get this report done, that we have finalized all of the witnesses, and then there's one more. And I remember in the discussions about having Mr. Elder come. This is the last one we need. Once we get his perspective on things, we don't need to have any more. We can move on with not just the reports, but the next study, which is on military justice. And I can tell you in my discussions with survivors, military justice is an incredibly, incredibly important piece. We know that we have former Justice Fish working on right now finalizing a review of the National Defense Act, which looks at military justice. And I know that we are right now as a committee, that is a very important study to move on to. So then we said, yes, of course, Mr. Elder came. And he said the exact same thing that all the other witnesses said, that clearly there was no substantive knowledge. I think his words were very limited knowledge about what the complaint was. Nonetheless, there was an attempt by PCO to reach out to try to have it investigated, and without knowing anything, not knowing what it is, not knowing who it is, there was very limited ability to be able to pursue any investigation. I think we heard from the clerk of the Privy Council that there was an impasse. But nonetheless, as we were preparing at that point to get the report, and I would note that there's a mention about differences of views about what this report is. This could be the single most important report that this committee does. This is one of the biggest issues facing the Canadian Armed Forces today. And I would note that, I mean, I obviously the report is still in draft form, so I can't comment on the report itself, but I can comment on the recommendations that I know the Liberal members put forward. And out of 24 recommendations coming from Liberal members, 23 are focused specifically on survivors and on how to fix the system moving forward. And I do believe there has been enough finger pointing. To be honest, we could do the same thing. We have now seen in the Toronto Star this weekend some really concerning, very, very concerning testimony, quotes where different people are saying different things, but what's becoming very apparent is that unlike in 2018, in 2015, it does not look like Mr. O'Toole's, the allegations that he brought forward were investigated at all. But in that case, they actually had something. They knew where it occurred. They knew what it was. They knew that it was a relationship with a subordinate. So there was actually something that could potentially have been followed up on, which, as we're starting to see, and I think we could elaborate on, there wasn't. And I'll be honest, I would love to have this committee have both Mr. Fadden and Mr. Novak sit here side by side and ask them questions, because both of them are saying different things. Mr. Novak came to this committee and was very clear that there was an investigation and that and that everything was done properly, and that it was Mr. Fadden that conducted the investigation. And now we find Mr. Fadden is saying to the media that he did not, in fact, conduct any investigation and has no recollection of it. So, you know, we could keep this study going and bring those witnesses. We could bring, I mean, honestly, I have a whole list here of people that we could add. And I'm not sure that, I mean, perhaps that's something that we need to do. But what I would prefer is, instead of continuing down this very politicized road where every single time there's another witness called, you think that we're going to be able to get that report done, and then yet another one. We had the chief of staff to the prime minister come, and even at that point, it's not enough. And now we're recycling back through the older witnesses, going back to Ms. Estravas and, going back to Mr. Walborn and the minister. Minister was here for 6 hours, this committee alone. And so it seems to me that at this point, what we're looking at is that I'm not convinced that the opposition wants to see this report see the light of day, or the other ones, because every time we get to a point where we can move forward as a committee, there's yet another motion, yet another series of witnesses to call, and now they're literally going back and recycling witnesses from previously who've already appeared. So I'm not entirely certain that that this is completely good faith. Now, having said that, I do want to address some of the things that are in this motion. So first of all, we have a piece here that talks about Zita Estravas. First of all, the
Madam
minister
Chair, point of order.
did come.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
We are speaking to the amendment. Not
Okay, so I'll save that for, I will save those comments for when we speak to the main motion. But in terms of the amendment, in terms of the process, I honestly think that if this committee is concerned about the survivors, about the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces, there are some very good recommendations in that draft report. I think that, and in the other two draft reports as well, I think that what we need to do, instead of continuing to put these procedural things and calling meetings so that we can have motion after motion that we want to surprise the other side with, and putting things in it that the other side won't agree, so that they have to keep the debate going. Honestly, I think what we should be doing is we should be getting the reports out and we should be moving on to the study on military justice and really trying to use the time that we have in this committee to work together to find ways to solve the problem. This is not a new problem. This is something that has existed for decades. And it is something that I believe all governments have tried to find solutions to. I know that I could go through all of the things that we have done since we came into. I am discussing the
proposed
amendment. I'm
and
discussing
she is
the need.
discussing our work line of business.
Madam Chair,
and
I'm
our
discussing
calendar.
the
So
process
could we
to
get
which
on
we
to
got
the
to this amendment.
please.
I'm discussing the process that we took to get to this amendment, and I
that
think
didn't
that
have
it's
anything to do
a
with it.
very poor process. It is, and I'm discussing what we could be doing instead of the amendment and the motion. Frankly, we could be doing some substantive work, getting substantive reports out that will really matter and make a difference. And I would hope, I know that everybody in this committee wants the best for the women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces. I have no doubt about that. And I would really hope that we can put the politics aside and that we can actually try to work together on the areas where there is agreement so that we can actually put some real recommendations forward. But in terms of just this particular amendment, I think it removes one of the very poorly drafted pieces of what I think is an attempt to just delay the committee. So of course we'll support taking that out. And if we want to go one by one, I would do the same for all of the parts of this motion, because I think the entire motion is just designed to take time. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Baker and then Madame Ellsliff.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I have much to say about the rest of the motion as well, but je vais parler un peu à propos de
I will talk about Mr. Barsalou-Duval's amendment a bit. I think that what Mr. Barsalou-Duval is proposing is very constructive. I applaud him for wanting to work in a constructive manner. In this case, I think that what Mr. Barsalou-Duval is proposing is to remove part of the motion, which would normally ask this committee to play the role of the police or some independent process, and we are not able to do that. We are a committee of elected members of parliament, and it's not up to elected members to conduct investigations. That's exactly what we heard many times by witnesses to this committee. We need to have processes that allow investigations of allegations by professionals and who are able to do that.
that. I think Mr. Barsalou-Duval has proposed something concrete. I think this section of the motion, which he has proposed to remove, it makes a lot of sense, because this particular element of Mr. Bazan's motion concerns allegations against Major General Danny Fortin, and those allegations need to be investigated by the appropriate bodies. We've heard from witness after witness at this committee that a lack of due process is part of the reason that so many members, so many victims, so many members of the armed forces have lost confidence in the processes that should be there to defend their very interests. And so this would go a counter to that very recommendation, which we have heard over and over and over again. And so the fact that it's even in here, I think, shows that that's in the motion, suggests that the drafter of the motion hasn't heard that or doesn't agree with it. That the drafter of the motion believes that that politicians should be investigating allegations, and I just don't think that that's appropriate. So I wanted to say that je supporte la proposition de.
So I support Mr. Barsalou-Duval's proposal, or his amendment, rather. And I think that if we really want to show that we learned something important and substantial from the testimony we heard in the past 3 or 4 months, one thing we learned is we need an independent process, independent from elected MPs. And therefore, we have to delete that part of the motion.
Mr. Baker, Madame Elleslev.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the clause, the point about investigating who knew what when in the government around the allegations against General Fortin must absolutely stay in this motion. And the reason why is not because we are looking to influence or interfere in any way with the due process or bring this into the court of a public opinion. What we are doing in this committee, our responsibility as legislators, is to hold the government to account. We are the elected representatives that Canadians have sent here to hold the government to the account. And the actions of the government, what they knew, how they acted, and what they did are what's material. Not General Fortin's allegations. We can leave that investigation quite separately. But how he remained in his position, how he was appointed to that position, who knew what when, and how they sat on this allegation as they sat on other allegations that have been brought forward at this committee and done nothing with. That is the responsibility of this committee, and it is our responsibility to Canadians to hold the government to account, to understand whether or not they acted appropriately in dealing with not only General Fortin, but also with the allegations around General Vance and the allegations around Admiral MacDonald, which leads us to Zita Astravas, who has been called repeatedly by the House of Commons as well as this committee to appear on this study before the committee. Now, the Minister of National Defence appeared in her stead, and for the moment, we as a committee decided that that was appropriate. However, since then, information has come to light that contradicts the information that the Minister of National Defence provided on Zita Astravas' behalf, and therefore the only way to know what actually took place is to hear from Zita herself, which is why that is a critical element that we've been trying to get to since the very beginning of this study. I, like Ms. Vanden Velde, am also disheartened by the tone that this committee is being forced or feels that they're being forced to take at this juncture. That is largely because of the way that the matters are being dealt with, from arbitrary suspensions to adjournments to, yes, filibustering to ensure that we can't get to a vote. If we really are wanting to move forward, then we need to be able to make our points clearly and succinctly, and then be able to get it to a vote and allow the will of the committee to transpire. Simply discussing and complaining about the tone, when in fact the tone could quite clearly change if it weren't a filibuster by various members, would go a long way to improving and allowing us to do the job that we actually have been sent here to do. Which brings me to my third and most important point. Yes, we do agree that this may be one of the most important studies that we as a defense committee have done, and at the moment in time that this information is required. And so we have seen from testimony, lengthy study witnesses' testimony, that the government perhaps did not behave the way that we expected them to behave appropriately, efficiently, or accordingly, and we need to make recommendations to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future. And that's why we need to put in place a timeline to ensure that this report moves at the pace that it needs to, and that various aspects of this committee are not able to unduly hold up the process. And secondly, and more importantly, I think we do need to understand from the government why, when they had the opportunity to implement all the recommendations in the Deschamps report, they didn't. Why, with Bill C-77, a clearly important aspect of victims' rights, they didn't implement those either.
Point of order,
So
Madam Chair.
we need to be moving
Madam Chair,
forward
point of order.
rather than holding things up.
Go ahead, Mr.
Thank
Spingman.
you.
I just wanted to refer to Ms. Gallen's most recent comments to keep this discussion focused on the amendment.
All right, thank you, Mr. Spangman. Madame Alislev, are you done, or have you got some more remarks?
For the moment, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have made my point.
All right, thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Spangman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'll be brief. Despite what my colleague just said, and I appreciate her argument, it will not be possible from a perception perspective to distinguish the kinds of things that she wishes to bring to the committee versus the kinds of things that are going to be subject to an investigation. There are now 3 investigations involving the former Chief of Defense Staffs, plural, and Major General Fortin. It's extremely important, and we've heard this time and again throughout the entire testimony on the study, that there be no political interference, and it's not just the actual political interference, it's the perception thereof. If the committee now is engaged in looking at these cases as cases, there's a great risk that arguments that will be brought before this committee and names that will be put forward by this committee would also be names and arguments that are going to be subject to the investigative process. And it's therefore extremely important that they be kept independent. For that reason, I would support the amendment that was brought forward, with my thanks to our colleague, Monsieur Barsalou-Duval. Even with the amendment, though, Madam Chair, I think when Mr. Bazan opened the discussion, he said he has a desire to dive in deeper. I think the motion taken as a whole is still an exercise that remains at the top level, that looks at individual cases and headlines at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and does not go into the depth of the systemic issues that the Canadian Forces face. And I think it's a little disingenuous to suggest that there are weeks of study left during which the committee could turn its attention to the recommendations, even with the amendment that's before us, and I support it, Madam Chair. I think there will be very little, if any, reasonable time left for the committee to actually look at, discuss, and prioritize the recommendations. So I disagree with the perception that's being created by Mr. Bazan that there is time, or weeks, plural, left to study the recommendations. There really aren't, especially with the additional names that the original motion wanted. It seems rushed, and it seems that there's no discussion to really turn the committee's attention to what matters most to the current and former serving members, particularly women of the Canadian Forces, which is how do we break the systemic challenge of sexual misconduct in the armed forces. If we just look at a couple of individual cases that are symptomatic of it, important as these cases are, but do nothing more than that in a fairly rushed report. That would be extremely unfortunate, and as my colleague has just pointed out, this is really an opportunity, perhaps the most important opportunity in this committee's recent history, to right-size a significant wrong, to correct a significant wrong across the nation that other countries are looking at as much as Canadians are. And it would not be a good outcome for this committee to not take that opportunity very, very seriously. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Spangman. To Mr. Bagnall, and then Monsieur Robillard. Go ahead, Mr. Bagnall.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'll just speak to the amendment as I think others have said. We've a lot to speak on. Mr. Baker said a lot to speak on the other parts of the motion. In fact, as people have said, it's a lot of substantive parts. It doesn't deal with the big issue, the elephant in the room in the military, but there's a lot of parts, and I think each one off to figure out whether each one should be discussed with an amendment because they're totally different and have different ramifications. So I'll just deal with this particular amendment first. I agree with Mr. Barcelou Duval on the amendment. You know, the surveys that have been done recently showed that there are hundreds of allegations continuing to go on, or also people that are aware of situations that are going on. So every few days there'd be a new one. We studied this every time these particular allegations. In fact, we've spent so many meetings on one email. Then we'll never really get to, as some members have said, the substantive items about misconduct in the military, the chain of command link, the fact that people are worried about reporting because of repercussions, and the whole culture item. So those are the things, rather than going complaint after complaint, witness after witness on one individual situation, on one email. As I've said in all the meetings, it would be much better to get on with recommendations to help the members of the military feel safe and deal with the substantive issues. So I'll leave it at that for now because I have a lot to say on the other parts of the motion, including the more serious allegations that are brought up about General Vance's appointment.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Rabia, please.
We heard enough. I'm asking for the vote.
Mr. Baker had his hand up already. Did you want to speak before the vote, Mr. Baker, or?
Sorry, I was having trouble finding my mute button or unmute button. I think, if I can, I'd just like to speak to the amendment. Can I do that, or is that?
Yes, please.
Okay. J'aimerais.
I'd like to add to what I said earlier. I think that Mr. Barcelou Duval's amendment gives us an opportunity to really learn from what we heard from witnesses. They told us that it's important when allegations are brought against someone that there be an independent process, an independent investigation. I think the fact that this motion or the original version of the motion proposed an investigation by members of Parliament into this affair. And I think that the people who drafted this part of the motion that Mr. Barcelou Duval wants to remove is in keeping with what witnesses said. That's all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Much, Mr. Baker. Then we'll go on with the vote on this is a vote on the amendment. Go ahead, Monsieur Clerc.
Mr. Bagnall?
Or
Mr. Baker?
Pour la motion. Pour l'amendement.
Monsieur Robillard? Monsieur Robillard?
Oui, pour l'amendement.
Ms. Vanden Bell?
In favor.
Mr. Benson?
against,
Yeah. Mr. Bizan,
Je vote contre.
Sallislab,
Against.
Gallant. Monsieur Barcelo Duval,
Pour.
Mr. Garrison,
In favor.
Yeas pour, 7, 7, nays contre, 4, 4.
Point of order, Mr. Clerk. I don't believe you had called my name. I'm in favor of the amendment.
My apologies, Mr. Spangman. With Mr. Spangman's vote, yeas pour, 7, 7, nays contre, 4, 7, 4, 4.
All right, so the amendment carries. Okay, Mr. Baker, your hand is up.
Madam Chair, I was hoping to speak to the motion.
Please, I think that's where we are now, to the motion.
Okay, thank you very much.
To the amended motion, correct.
To the amended motion, that's correct.
Yep.
So there are a few points I wanted to raise. First off, I want to speak to something that Ms. Vandenbeld spoke to, which is the way in which this motion was brought forward. This is a substantive motion. There are many elements to it with a range of implications. And I think the fact that it was brought forward minutes before this committee meeting starts, as has been done, frankly, by the members opposite many times during the hearings on this study, is incredibly disappointing. And the reason that is, and the reason notice is given, and the members opposite know that, is because it gives members who haven't yet seen the motion a chance to consider the implications of the motion, and therefore use our time in committee productively. And because that's hasn't been done on multiple occasions, including this time, and Chair, you've spoken to this at a number of the meetings, how table dropping motions at the last minute is counterproductive. And despite those flags, the members opposite decided to do that again. And I think I'm concerned about it because it doesn't allow the members who haven't seen the motion to be able to properly consider the motion before having to debate it and ultimately vote on it. And I have the opportunity to work with the members opposite, some of the members opposite in other settings, and that's not how I treat the members opposite in the committees, not even the committees, but some of the other projects that I work with them on. So I would just I want to take this opportunity to ask the members opposite to not do that, as certainly I on my end would not do that to them, and it's counterproductive to our committee's work. As far as the other point I wanted to raise was that the fact that this meeting of course is being held because of a 1064 motion by 4 of the Conservative members, which is why we are meeting during a constituency week. And what's particularly disappointing about this meeting, aside from the fact that a motion was brought at the last minute without warning, as I've already spoken to, but what's also disappointing is that the Conservatives chose to use this meeting to bring forward a motion that really seeks to do nothing more but politicize this issue further and play further political games with an issue that deserves a substantive study, substantive recommendations, and substantive work by thoughtful MPs who actually care about solving the problem of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. That's what this should be about. And this motion is not that. This motion is about trying to call more and more witnesses to answer the questions that have already been answered countless times before this committee, and that have absolutely nothing to do with actually tackling the problem of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces. It boggles my mind that after those questions have been answered over and over and over again, in some cases, having the same witnesses come back over and over and over again to answer the same questions over and over and over again, we're recycling witnesses in this motion. Recycle calls for the calling of witnesses that we've already heard from, just to answer questions we've already heard the answers to multiple times and had evidence presented to answer those questions multiple times. And so to me, this is incredibly disappointing, and I'm being diplomatic, because what we should be doing is focusing every single, in my view, we should be focusing every minute we possibly can at this committee in actually writing the report that actually makes a difference for the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who are suffering sexual harassment, sexual assault. So how can we sit here, how can members sit here and say they care about that issue when they want to use virtually, this motion calls for using the majority of the committee's time to further politicize this issue, to call more witnesses to answer the same questions, which serve only to further politicize the process. No matter what those answers are to those questions, they serve nothing, they do nothing to help the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who need our help. All of you have said that you've spoken to, all the members of this committee have said they've spoken to men and women in the Canadian Armed Forces who are asking us, many of them are begging us to take action on this issue, to make recommendations, to voice our position on what should be done. And that's what that report is for. That's the mechanism by which we as a committee can do that. We as MPs can make a difference. That's why we all ran for office, was to make a difference. Here's an opportunity to make a difference. And instead of making a difference on that issue, this motion calls for more politics. What message does that deliver to the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces? I would just ask my colleagues opposite to think about that. Let's get to work on that report. Let's use every single minute we can at this committee to write that report, to make a difference. And instead, we're putting forward a motion that calls for the recycling of witnesses, for more politicization. Like, I suspect that many victims, many survivors are watching this committee. And I cannot imagine what they're thinking when they see this type of motion brought forward. Like, this doesn't signal, this motion doesn't say those who are supporting this motion aren't saying, I'm serious about tackling this issue. They're saying they're serious about more politics and games and drawing headlines. Folks, I'm sorry. That's not why I ran for office. That's not why the folks in Etobicoke Centre elected me to be here. They elected me to solve problems that face Canadians. And the biggest problem that faces the Canadian Armed Forces at this moment is sexual harassment and sexual assault. So let's solve it. Let's get to work. Let's write a report. Let's make a difference. That's why I'm here. And so the fact that we have this meeting during a constituency, when my constituents, all the constituents of all the members of this committee, when all of their constituents are facing a pandemic and need their MPs to be available to them, is disappointing. Because what we could have done, what we should be doing, is focused on writing that report. And we've had, but if we're going to meet during a constituency week, if we were going to meet during this constituency week and we were going to actually try to tackle this issue and write the report and make a difference for the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, I'd be all for it. And I'm sure my constituents would be very supportive of it. But that's not what this is about. I have to tell my constituents that I'm not focused on responding to their needs during a pandemic because I need to be part of a discussion about political games that the opposition wants to play. How is that okay? So I'm disappointed on that front as well. And I think my constituents who are watching this would be as well. And I would think constituents of some of the other members would be disappointed as well. I think the other thing I want to say is that I think that, the motion itself focuses on questions we've heard the answers to. And I just think we've heard the answers. We can write the report. And if the members want to write a report about and make it full of the political conclusions that they've drawn, then they can propose that, and that can be part of the discussion around the writing of the report. Or they can write a dissenting report if that's not the will of the committee. That's their choice. We've heard the answers to these questions. Let's do what we were elected to do, which is write a report that serves the members of the Canadian Armed Forces, that serves the victims who've told us that they want action. Let's take action. That's why I ran for office. I think that's why all of the other members did too. Let's get to work on the report. Let's defeat this motion and do that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Mr. Spangeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And on the main motion, and I want to thank colleagues for the change we took on the through the amendment. You know, we've said a lot about the virtue of having the power to summon somebody, and in the minds of, I think, many of us, the restraint that we need to exercise when deciding to actually issue a summons. This is a tool that's best held in the committee's vest pocket as something to use only as a last resort in extreme circumstances. We've had extensive testimony from officials at the Prime Minister's office, from officials at the Privy Council office, from the Minister himself for 6 hours in front of this committee alone. And as my colleague, Mr. Baker, just said, you know, the sort of desire on the part of some of us to want to recycle through some of that testimony, I think at this point, with the runway that we have left, really isn't helpful. I want to take Mr. Bazan at his words again that I cited just in my last intervention, that there, you know, he's expressed a desire to dive in deeper, to really do the work to correct the issue of systemic sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces. And diving in deeper doesn't just mean let's look at the most recent case in the headlines. It means let's look at the recommendations in the Deschamps report. It means look at the witness testimony. It means listen to the minister who has flung the door open saying the time for patience is over and we need complete culture change now. And the volume of recommendations in our minds and discussion, hopefully within this committee, is extensive. And prioritizing those recommendations is incredibly important to serving women, to former serving members of the Canadian Forces, to male allies, to recruits, to members of our reserves deployed overseas, deployed at home. Nothing could be more important at the moment for the Canadian Forces. And so with respect to the time frame that we have when we look at the motion and the window of the 28th, with an added desire to bring in more witnesses now, that's a weekend change to drill through these recommendations and prioritize them and actually identify the ones that are going to be most impactful and to pass them through the House of Commons before we break for the summer. This is hard work. This is work that will take discussion among ourselves. This is work that will take place not in front of a camera, but as colleagues with disagreement, yes, but with the desire to actually achieve the change. When Mr. Bazan brings a motion and says, I want to dive in deeper, this motion leaves out a significant issue, Madam Chair. When the former Chief of Defence Staff was appointed, there are witnesses whom we could potentially and maybe should hear from again. In the same breath as Mr. Bazan brings forward the name of Ms. Astrovas, we could ask for Richard Fadden, we could ask for Ray Novak, we could ask for Aaron O'Toole, who at the time of appointment of the former Chief of Defence Staff were in office. I'm not saying this to be partisan. I'm saying this because the former Chief of Defence Staff is now reported in the media to have said that he, quote unquote, owns the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. Back in 2015, he felt that he, quote unquote, owned the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. From a systemic perspective, from the deep-rooted systemic sexual misconduct problem that the Canadian Forces have, nothing could be more important than a former Chief of Defence Staff saying that he owned the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service. How can any one official rise to a position of power, asymmetric power within the Canadian Forces, to have that kind of influence and to potentially alter or quash or get rid of investigative processes at the stroke of a pen or at the click of a keyboard? That is a systemic issue that is far removed or far beyond the name of Jonathan Vance. That is a systemic issue that my Conservative colleagues and colleagues from all parties on this committee should be deeply interested in. And if I saw the names that I just mentioned and a desire to look at this in this motion, I would say this is a transpartisan motion that is really focused on the issue at hand. But we don't see their names. So I take my comment from my colleague, Mr. Baker, seriously, that this is not a time to play partisan politics. This is a time to move to the same side of the table with very limited runway left and with full knowledge of what the recommendations are that are at issue. We've got them, we've identified them. What we need to do now is prioritize them, sequence them, and adopt them and pass them as a committee, not in a single session or without any further discussion, but with deliberation, with thoughtful input from all sides, having listened to our experts, our witnesses, and the women and men who serve in the Canadian Forces. And not just in this Parliament, we've heard their voices in the previous Parliament and other studies. The issues are known, the willingness on the part of the minister and this government are there. The country is now looking to this committee as the pivot point to take these recommendations and put them into the hands of government so that in very, very short order, we will have made the changes that are so urgently needed. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Mr. Baker said, we've heard all sorts of testimony about the big problem, sexual misconduct in the military, and three overriding themes that aren't addressed in this motion. One being the culture, two being the fear of reporting, and provisions to deal with those so that people feel safe outside the chain of command. And as Mr. Baker said very passionately, which is why I won't use all my time right now, but we've both said since we started, that's what we should be focusing on to get the answers to those major problems so that people can again feel, or for the first time feel safe, especially women in the military, that those problems that so many have said in reports they are aware of or has affected them directly. So I sympathize with Mr. Garrison comments that we should get on with it, the three reports, and I pass that on to anyone that keeps doing motions to bring more witnesses, to deal with the one email. We had one email the person didn't want, had every right not to have the details provided, so it was investigated right away. And yet we're dealing with meeting after meeting after meeting on that one email when we should be dealing with the major issues in the military. And it would be easy to do if we just got on to the report. On the elements of the motion, the first element's related to a witness that we've already dealt with. The minister replaced that witness, and so obviously we need an amendment related to that and a discussion on that. A second item, as the chair said, this is a very complicated motion, so I still have to have more study on it. And obviously we have to have more discussion and debate down the road on an amendment related to the scheduling of the report. I don't see that it leaves very many meetings to discuss the substantive recommendations in the report on the schedule that's proposed in the study. And it seems like that the motion suggests that a whole bunch of clauses, and there's many clauses and recommendations. And as Ms. Vanderbilt said, all the Liberal recommendations, except perhaps one, deal with the survivors and these problems that we're talking about. But it sounds like the report is the motion is suggesting that for all those that aren't dealt with in the short period of time, that they just are voted on without any discussion, without any politicians that have been elected by their party to be able to comment on and give their provisions on, and just have a vote. I mean, I would be interested when we get to, so I think we have to have an amendment on that at some time in the future. But when we get to that, I would really like to know, and research can be done between now and when that happens, as to what kind of precedent there is for just approving a report clause by clause with no discussion, or recommendation by recommendation with no discussion, at minimally, I would find it that people wouldn't really take such a report seriously if you weren't even allowed to debate it. You weren't even allowed to debate the recommendations, put comments
Point of order, Madam
related.
Chair.
Go ahead, stand by. Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
Okay. When in this meeting, we have not discussed in this meeting putting forth this report without going clause by clause.
Sorry, my understanding was that there wouldn't be any discussion on each clause after a particular. That's why when you drop a complicated motion, we haven't had time to analyze, and I wonder what Mr. Garrison thinks about getting a motion a few minutes before our meeting, so that we don't have time to analyze what the ramifications of these details about the discussion, about the way the report would go when we meet the deadline. So that's why I'm asking these questions, and I think they need, because I don't understand that process, which is in the motion, and that's why we need to at least debate it. And I'd like to know, as I said, precedent on that and what the actual ramifications of that part are. And then finally, I want to go into great detail later. As was mentioned earlier in the meeting, there's far more, if we can't get down to the serious recommendations that we should be to help the Canadian military related to chain of command and fear of reporting and culture, if we have to keep studying these general events, then as was mentioned before, that recently, probably after the motion was written, which is why it's not as relevant, is that much more serious allegations have come related to the appointment of the Minister of General Vance, and investigations that were or were not done. And but I'll go into all that later. And I'm assuming that that's still a work in progress too, that there's more information coming out on those serious allegations that have been raised by the Toronto Star and Global News and whoever else did those investigations. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll go into that in great detail, and then probably the next time I'm up.
All right, Madame Vanderbilt, you're next.
Unless Mr. Baker, I'm not sure who had her hand up first.
Kind of at the same time.
Okay, if he wants, okay, I'll go. Thank you.
If you don't mind, then I'll let Mr. Baker go first. Is that all right?
Okay,
thanks. Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. So I just wanted to share with the committee some of the, in my previous intervention, I spoke about how important it is, I think, that we address what the underlying problem here of sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military, and get to a report, because I think that's the way in which this committee can actually make a difference on this issue. And so I wanted to share with you, there's some, these are remarks, they're not long, but they're remarks from Christine Wood. I think many of you have met Christine Wood, and to me, Christine Wood is someone who's incredibly courageous and is taking her experience and translating it into advocacy. I find Christine honestly inspiring. So I want to share with you some of the things that she said to FIWO, and I'll just share it with you here. It's not very long. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to represent the group. It's just 700.
Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
Are we debating the motion, or are we debating a recommendation in the forthcoming report? I don't understand what this quote has to do with the motion before us today.
Madam Gallant, I think if you just took the time to hear me out, you'd understand.
We've
the
taken a
relevance
lot
this.
of time. Let's get on with the motion.
Go ahead,
Madam Speaker,
Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Madam Chair, I'm speaking to the motion.
Please go ahead, Mr. Baker.
I'll start at the beginning. This is from Christine Wood. These are remarks she delivered to FIWO. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to represent the group. It's just 700. 5 weeks ago, unexpectedly, the founder of our group, Marie-Claude Gagnon, who most people know as MC, stepped down. She stepped away from It's Just 700. After 6 years of advocacy at the highest levels of government, she has reached a point where the cost of giving insight, voice, and access to hundreds of men and women is too great a price to pay alone. So something simple but important to remember as we engage today is that this is hard stuff. This is ugly stuff. Sexual assault isn't talked about lightly. It's an ugly side of human nature. At this point, I really believe that sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces is a national embarrassment. Our collective Canadian conscience has been hit hard by the recent high-profile allegations of inappropriate sexual behavior by our most senior leaders. It is outrageous that two chiefs of defense have faced allegations within weeks of each other, but it's even more outrageous to accept that every year, on average, 1,600 people report a sexual assault within the Canadian Armed Forces. This isn't friendly fire. It's not an accident or an honest mistake. It's rape and it's abuse of authority. I can tell you things that you have heard before. Victims need supports. There are more and more coming forward, and there is still no safety net there to catch them. These individuals are not coming forward to report a simple discrepancy that they saw in paperwork. They are coming forward with their experiences of terror, debilitating anxiety, and shredded self-confidence. They are broken. It is simply unethical to continue to ask them to come forward without having a plan in place to support them. To be clear, we are asking for the same supports that we were asking for 4 years ago: a national platform for online peer support, group therapy, outpatient therapy, and inpatient psychiatric care when necessary that is MST specific in its focus. It needs to be trauma informed and needs to be able to address the moral injury of betrayal by your brothers and sisters in uniform. The nature, duration, and severity of our injuries is something that every affected individual is struggling to explain right now. That's the terminology used in the settlement forms for the class action lawsuits: the nature, the duration, and the severity. So many people are struggling to find the words. It's not easy, and neither are the next steps forward. Up front, I need to say again that we need care. It has to be targeted. Post-traumatic stress disorder is chronic, and it can be deadly. It doesn't matter where the trauma came from. The end result is what it is. Sexual trauma is not necessarily worse or easier than combat trauma. It's just different. I'm sure you're aware of the following: that 1 in 5 victims is a man, that military life is exceptional, but places exceptional roadblocks in accessing care, and that we frequently are posted and moving or on long-term training courses, and most often are away from our extended family. It's unfortunate that we're still trying to get an agreed upon definition of military sexual trauma, MST, as now it is an American term. If we in Canada can develop our understanding in black and white of military sexual trauma, we can have greater research data and access and provide targeted treatment. So I share that testimony because for a few reasons. One is, I think, to me anyway, it's a reminder of why we're here, of the issue of what's at stake. That there are so many people like Christine Wood. Christine Wood's advocating for many others. And I guess I wanted to remind folks of what's at stake and the suffering that people are going through. Through that testimony that I just read to you, Christine Wood speaks to how long victims have been waiting, or not waiting for a solution in terms of the care, solution in terms of changes in culture, so many elements that we've heard about at this committee from witnesses, experts in the field, members of the forces, etc. And so I highlight that point that Ms. Wood made because I think I don't want to keep them waiting any longer. I don't think we should. Ms. Wood, and I think the motion that's before us asks us to, basically what it would do is it would dedicate the committee's time to more politics and more headline grabbing rather than addressing what Ms. Wood is fighting for and advocating for. And the fact that she speaks to how long she and others have been waiting, I think, I don't know, to me, it motivates me to get this done. And maybe it's because of, this type of, maybe one of the reasons that they've been waiting so long is because at committees like this that have preceded me, at least in this parliament, in the House of Commons, that maybe the discussions have been highly politicized like this one. I don't know, but I'd love for us to break through our sort of the politics and just let's deliver for these folks, right? Let's deliver from Christine Wood, the others she's advocating for. In the testimony that I just read to you, Ms. Wood talks about sexual misconduct, and these are her words, that sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces is a national embarrassment. And I think I agree. And I think the only thing that would exacerbate that embarrassment for me, and I think for many people, would be if this committee ended up playing more politics instead of tackling the issue at hand, and solving the problem, or helping to solve the problem at the very least. I think she talks about in the segment that I just read, Ms. Wood talks about how the Canadian conscience has been hit hard by high-profile allegations of inappropriate sexual behavior by our most senior leaders. She says it's outrageous that 2 chief of defense staff has faced allegations within weeks of each other. And then she says it's even more outrageous to accept that every year, on average, 1,600 people report sexual assault within the CAF. In her testimony, Ms. Wood is not asking us as a parliamentary committee, she's asking us to find solutions. She's not asking us to headline grab and draw attention and point fingers at people, point fingers at each other, point fingers at anybody. She's asking us to solve the problem, ease the pain that people are feeling. And she talks about, these are her words, victims need supports. She says there are more and more coming forward and there is still no safety net there to catch them. Let's help create that safety net, right? Let's do that. We've heard from members of the committee. The members of this committee have heard from witnesses. Talked about what that safety net needs to look like, how it should be structured. We've heard from Madame Deschamps, we've heard from other experts who've talked about what that looks like. Okay, let's translate that into something concrete. She's talking about people coming forward with experience of terror, debilitating anxiety, and shredded self-confidence, the fact that they are broken. And then she says it is simply unethical to continue to ask them to come forward without having a plan in place to support them. So if it's unethical, if you agree with Ms. Wood, I agree with her. If it's unethical, then let's help solve that problem. And if we prolong that agony, if we prolong that lack of solution because of this motion, which would have us move away from the solutions and play politics, then we're contributing to that. Let's not contribute to that. Let's fix it. She talks about the fact that we're asking for the same supports. These are her words. We're asking for the same supports that we were asking for 4 years ago. She talks about a national platform for online peer support, group therapy, outpatient therapy, inpatient psychiatric care, et cetera. She says it needs to be trauma informed. It needs to be able to address the moral injury of betrayal by your brothers and sisters in uniform. She says they're asking for the same support they were asking for 4 years ago. Like, are we going to be reading more testimony from Christine Wood or those who follow her 4 years from now? That's unacceptable. But if we're not we're going to contribute constructively by writing a report, recommending some of these things, or the things we want to recommend, whatever those things are, then, and I think we should recommend these things for what it's worth, but whatever those things are that the members of this committee heard, then we're not helping contribute to solving that problem. So I guess I'm not talked about all her testimony, I've talked about elements of it. I've read it all to you, but then I've picked out segments to highlight components that some of the components that speak to me. I guess I'm just imploring the members of the opposition to the members of this committee to heed her words. And I think if Christine Wood were here, it would be very difficult to look her in the eye, I would think, and say that it's a good idea for us to pass this motion and spend almost all of the vast majority of the committee's time not writing the report that could help her and her colleagues and the others she represents, and instead playing politics. I think it would be very hard to look her in the eye.
Point of order.
Thank you. Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
I might point out that there have been several recommendations made by Deschamps almost 6 years ago now that could have been implemented. So if he was genuine about what he's saying, those can be implemented right away.
Debate, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madame Gallant. All right. Thank you.
I think that
go ahead, Mr. Baker. You can finish.
Thank you. Anyway, I think where I was for that point of order was just summarizing, and what I was saying was that I'm inspired by Christine Wood and people like her. She's suffering. Her colleagues are suffering. They're showing a tremendous amount of courage, and they've spoken about how long they've been waiting. And if we can contribute even 1 ounce towards that solution, towards alleviating that suffering, even just a little bit, I think that should be our #1 priority. And let's make it our priority. Let's defeat this motion, and let's solve this problem. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. On to Mr. Bagnall and then Mr. Spangman. I think you might be on mute, Mr. Bagnall.
Sorry. It's always hard to go after Mr. Baker because I think he's saying what many committee members are thinking, but can't say as well. I think all the committee members want to help the members of CAF with the three main problems that Christine had outlined: the chain of command, the reporting, and the culture. And as I said before, that's what we should get onto. And in reply to what Mrs. Gallant said, I agree with her that there were a lot of things in the Deschamps report. It's been outlined in this committee, many steps that were taken by the present minister, but there are things that were not done. And so the form that they should take is exactly what we should be discussing now to deal with those particular issues. So as I said, I'd rather we just stopped all this and got on to dealing with those three major issues to help the members in the military. But for those who, if there are committee members that still want to do the who, know, what, why, where, as was said earlier in this meeting, there's been much more serious allegations raised probably since this motion was written, and certainly since the last meetings, related to the appointment of General Vance in the beginning. Mr. O'Toole, when he was Veterans Affairs, passed on a potential rumor or complaint to Ray Novak, who very nicely came before committee and provided his thoughts on that. He mentioned that he had asked the National Security Advisor, Mr. Fadden, Richard Fadden, about the Gagetown incident to look into it. And Mr. Fadden, the media has suggested that Mr. Fadden has said he does not remember that, investigating that particular complaint or actually receiving it. Although he doesn't disagree with Mr. Novak's memory of events, that he may have mentioned it to Mr. Fadden, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that investigation, or that it was acted upon. And so if there was a complaint and it wasn't investigated or it wasn't acted upon, or then why was the General Vance appointed? All these things, I think we need more details on. I've just heard from the media. I haven't had time to sort it out. Some of them I just saw this morning, and the others I was just reading on the weekend. But the outgoing chief of staff at the time said he was crystal clear. There was no allegation related to the misconduct by Vance at Gagetown that was ever brought to him, and he was helping with the appointment of a new chief of staff. And he said he was crystal clear about that in the article, including that when he was helping find a replacement, he would have remembered any allegation, he said. And he said his mind was not fussy at all about that. There was another investigation related to NATO, and the Richard McFadden, and I think the outgoing chief of staff mentioned that, but not on the Gagetown one. And I think those members on the committee that honestly really want to go into, as I said, I don't want to go into any of this, but honestly really want to know who, what, and where. This is a much more serious allegation. Megan McKenzie, an expert on sexual misconduct in the military at Simon Fraser, said no one handled it well. But if the investigation was still open, or any investigation was still open, then why did Cabinet appoint General Vance? And then the military police recommended an end to an investigation apparently on July 17th, the day that General Vance was sworn in. And then 4 days later, it was closed. So how did that process evolve on those dates? Like, all these I'm sure there will have things that are still evolving, although whoever is researching this. And as I said, that's, if we have to go into how, when, why, and where, these are much more serious allegations and would have to be dealt with. But that's not my interest. My interest is in helping the women in the military, going back to recommendations that would change the culture, that would change the fact that their fear of reporting, and that there's so many incidences, rather than spending time on these one or two instances and one or two individuals, we should just get on with the major, substantial structural problem. You know, even though there's hundreds, probably thousands of incidents, you know, an incident affects the person for the rest of their lives. It's not just the momentary incident. And so that's why we have to, I think, just put all this aside and get down to recommendations to solve those three problems, so that people are never again feared to choose a great career in the military with the great honor of protecting us as citizens, not worry if they make a report of something inappropriate, that it's going to affect their career that they've invested their lives in, not allow it to occur because of a culture that is accepted and has occurred not only in our military, but as Mr. Spengeman said, and has brought evidence in militaries around the world. And I think there's people on the committee that have the ability to deal with those problems and get on with them and come up with some very good recommendations. And that would be my preference at this time, but I'll leave that up to the committee. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. On to Mr. Spengeman. Thank you. And then Madame Sidhu. Go ahead, Mr. Spengeman.
Madam Chair, thank you. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank both of my colleagues immediately preceding for their interventions, Mr. Baker and Mr. Bagnall. The human dimension of this is front and center. It ranks top of mind. It makes this an issue that we simply need to tackle. The expectations could not be higher. And we need to move forward and bring a report that will make a difference, that will change the Canadian Forces structurally. Mr. Baker made reference to the experience that we see elsewhere in the world, and in previous interventions a few weeks ago, I had a chance to introduce some of these considerations and experiences, and I introduced them, Madam Chair, because this is really, in addition to the substance of these experiences, which is helpful to the committee as we now very rapidly approach the deadline in our time frame for consideration of this report. Certainly as proposed by the motion, which in fact is next week. I'm hoping that the committee will take a different path and will allow for more incubation of these issues and more impactful recommendations before we break for the summer recess. But I raised these considerations from other countries, and they included a range, Madam Chair: South Africa, the UK, Sweden, Australia, in addition to institutional work that was done by NATO and by institutions like the Center for the Democratic Control of the Armed Forces, as it was then known, in Geneva. Around the world with militaries that are similar in structure and in orientation and in expertise and in vision and training to ours, that there's such a great incident rate really underscores the structural systemic nature of the issue that we're facing. It simply isn't limited to the cases of, however many we have here in Canada, disturbing as that is. Unless we change the structure, it is a recipe for the generation of additional cases and additional victims. So that is one part of the consideration why these comparative experiences from other countries are so important, and why we actually should work together with militaries elsewhere and share our expertise and share our story. As Madam Chair, the United Kingdom has done. I raised that as one example that's particularly salient. The Wixton report that was put together by Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Wixton conducted a thorough review in 2019. And the advantage that we have from the UK experience is that the very next year in 2020, they published a progress report on unacceptable behavior. So not only did they get out front of the issue in considerable detail and with recommendations that are impactful and my submission to some extent replicable and emulatable here in Canada, they also did the follow-up work to see if the recommendations worked and to actually harness in the very short term the reaction within the British Armed Forces and the British public. And Madam Chair, one of the key considerations that's before the committee in all of the interventions from my colleagues across party lines is the question of trust in the Canadian Forces, and trust by serving members and former serving members, and trust that victims should have in coming forward and voicing concerns and making complaints. And on this level, I think the UK experience is helpful, and I'm going to put forward to the committee for consideration some of the thoughts that relate to the question of trust, particularly with respect to the chain of command that's been subject of the discussion today and is relevant to the motion. The chain of command really is a fundamental structural obstacle with respect to the resolution of sexual misconduct cases. And the UK really took this issue seriously, acknowledged it, and came up with
point of order.
I believe.
We've heard this in a previous filibuster on this exact same report. So I'm wondering what the relevance is with respect to this motion we're debating itself. And, he's putting evidence on, or more evidence, or repeating, more accurately, the evidence we heard during the filibuster that was given previously. So could he speak to the actual motion that is before us, as opposed to debating something that is not before us?
All right. Thank you, Madame Gallant. Carry
Madam
on,
Chair,
Mr.
thank you very much for the point of order. Let me just respond briefly. I mean, it's
Yes, please.
it's well and good procedurally what the Conservatives have put forward, what they would like to discuss in the form of a motion. They also seek to shut down debate within this committee on this report within a week and a half, and I believe there are very fundamental considerations. Other countries have done the work that this committee has not yet done, and therefore I'm going to take time to put those considerations before this committee in an expedited fashion to make sure that if we don't do the work ourselves, we at least have the experience of those countries in front of us that have done this and are making progress. And I would urge you, Madam Chair, to rule that this is directly relevant to the motion. The Conservatives may wish to discuss their preferred outcome of the motion. I'm going to put to the committee what I believe are the fundamental considerations that within the very short time frame we have, we need to engage in. And with that, Madam Chair, the Air Chief Marshal Wixton concluded in his findings on the question of trust. And trust, as I said a minute ago, is front and center in every consideration with respect to this issue. There's a breakdown of trust that's been acknowledged by the Minister, by the Prime Minister, by witnesses, and I believe in large part by every member of this committee. We're dealing with a fundamental breakdown of trust on the issue of systemic challenges with respect to sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces.
This
The United
report,
Kingdom-
point of order, Madam Chair, this report has already been read out to the committee.
It has
so
not,
they have
Madam
to put
Gallant, it
out
has not.
new information.
Madam
The
Gallant,
Wixton
I read
report, yes, perhaps he wasn't here
Thank
that day, but we heard the whole Wixton report. It was recited to us over hours.
I don't think I did. Maybe.
Madam Chair, if I may
Okay,
respond.
go
that is-
ahead,
that is
Mr.
absolutely-
Spangeman. Go ahead.
I've kept very careful tabs on my document in terms of where I left off last time. And as I said, this report is extensive but illuminating. And there is also a follow-on report that outlines progress in 2020. The Wixton report section that I'm referring to now is with respect to trust and specifically what other stakeholders think of governance structures and concerns within the British Armed Forces. That is evidence, not evidence, that is information that I have not put to the committee in previous interventions. And I will now proceed to do so with your indulgence.
Point
Madam
of
Chair.
order.
Madame Gallant.
This motion before us is requesting that Zita Estravis come before us. So did Zita go before the committee in the UK as a witness on the Wixton report?
Again, Madam Chair, the Conservatives may wish to discuss what's in their motion. I'm going to refer the committee to what I think we should be doing instead of shutting down this process on the 28th of May as the motion proposes. There are serious gaps and considerations with respect to trust that come from other countries with helpful evidence, with helpful research and helpful conclusions that I believe the committee needs to hear. If we're not having the discussions among ourselves as we should, I will put some of these considerations forward because they will be helpful to what we should be putting into this report and what Canadian Forces members and the Canadian public really expects us to be doing. We often look to our friends and allies within the Five Eyes and other jurisdictions. And in this case, the United Kingdom actually has done some very substantial and progressive and quick work, I should say, on this very issue that's before the committee today. The report states that there's a notable perception, Madam Chair, among external stakeholders that trust in the system in the United Kingdom is not as strong as it used to be. Over half of the external stakeholders consulted without prompting alluded to this sentiment. Some of them considered that units are sweeping issues under the carpet through a protect the cap badge mentality, and for presentational reasons up to the organizational chain of command. And Madam Chair, it requires no further thought to see how relevant these insights are to our considerations here in Canada. Support organizations suggest more requests for help are being lodged externally rather than through internal support channels, partly due to the association of these organizations with the chain of command, but also as a last resort when the chain of command has failed them. In many cases, it was reported to us that victims are afraid to report an issue as they do not believe they will be understood or taken seriously. Cultural differentials play strongly into this space. The chain of command is not normally culturally representative of those under their command, and so people fear or experience unconscious bias through issues being considered in a manner which lacks empathy or understanding of the significance of a situation to the person. Madam Chair, a very detailed and human approach by the United Kingdom that's directly relevant to what we should be considering here today. Confidence in the system and the willingness to come forward. We've talked about this at length over sessions of testimony. In the United Kingdom, the report states that we heard repeated suggestions of service people not reporting inappropriate or unacceptable behavior because of a fear of the consequences of doing so. Similarly, military culture and a rigid hierarchy inhibits bystander intervention and the ability of lower ranks to challenge the behaviors of their seniors. Such fears include the impact on their career prospects, being perceived as a troublemaker, the issue being placed on their career records, potential consequences on career and home life, the potential that stepping forward would aggravate the situation, a fear of not fitting in, segregation and no longer being treated as a member of the group, not being believed, their concern not being taken seriously, and the chain of command at every level lacking the time to do anything with the issue. Many simply consider that reporting inappropriate behavior to their chain of command would get them nowhere, a pattern which the Service Complaints Ombudsman has also recognized. The net result suggests a sense of helplessness among some of our people who either keep quiet or turn to fully anonymous external service for help. So the service complaints system in the United Kingdom. The 2018 report from the Service Complaints Ombudsman noted the majority of users who did make a service complaint were dissatisfied with the time taken to resolve the complaint, and 3/4 considered they had sufficient negative consequences as a result of pursuing a formal complaint. Across the services, only 50% of service complaints were closed within the 24-week target, falling significantly short of the 90% target on average. It is currently taking 53 weeks to resolve a bullying, harassment, or discrimination service complaint in the United Kingdom. External stakeholders told us our people have lost faith in the service complaint system. It is perceived to lack independence from the chain of command at every level, and many of our stakeholders question its ability to be impartial or for people to use it without attracting negative consequences. The Service Complaints Ombudsman has noted in successive annual reports the lack of confidence in the system also continues to be a key issue, and one which requires considerable focus and attention if we are ever to achieve an efficient, effective, and fair system. The view of the external stakeholder community as reported to us is consistent and clear. The connection of a complaints organization which allows for anonymous reporting and support for people affected and external to the armed forces would allow people the freedom to make a complaint without fear of reprisal. We return to this point in part 3 of the report, goes Mr. Sir Michael Wixton. So the observation in this case that was identified is that external stakeholders highlight shortcomings in how defense deals with instances of inappropriate behavior, the efficacy of the current service complaints system especially. The report then goes to questions of mandatory training within the armed forces. It states that all services deliver mandated training on diversity, inclusion, and values. It is often delivered within a tight time scale and can, in some areas, focus on compliance rather than behaviors and culture change. And this is directly relevant to Canada, Madam Chair, in the sense that recommendations may well include recommendations for increased training within the Canadian Armed Forces, and the British experience tells us what the constraints and shortfalls of such training initiatives may be and how they may be adapted to better serve the service, the purpose of achieving true culture change. Senior officers must attend a one-day course every 3 years. Feedback from the Defense Academy indicates that the senior officer course or courses are often undersubscribed due to frequent last-minute dropouts and pressures on diaries. They make a recommendation to the effect that mandated diversity, inclusion, and values training must be prioritized in the British Armed Forces, irrespective of rank. And then, Madam Chair, if you'll indulge, with respect to additional training in the British Armed Forces, the Armed Forces deliver sessions on behaviors, ethics, culture, and inclusion within their command courses, usually during leadership modules. In the best cases, the training becomes more interactive with scenario-based role play which carries more impact and is much better perceived or received than formal presentations or online training. The naval service training approach already reflects significantly greater emphasis on culture change rather than compliance. The Royal Air Force have similarly implemented behaviors and perceptions workshops for military and civilian personnel. Army analysis also recognizes the value of peer-based discursive learning. Subject-specific training interventions include sexual behaviors training by military police and novel approaches such as a dilemma and respect for others scenario-based training delivered in partnership with trained facilitators. Immersive training approaches such as these are engaging, effective, and recognized as leading practice. All indications are positive. However, there's no established pan-defense process for measuring the impact of these training programs. There's also a pressing need for training interventions aimed specifically to address the overrepresentation of minority groups, women, and junior ranks in the complaints process. The British Armed Forces report makes 3 recommendations, which is to maximize the use of immersive values-based training across defense, that defense should investigate causes of overrepresentation of minority groups, women, and junior ranks in the complaints process, and implement the necessary training interventions as part of an overarching strategy to address the issue. And defense should develop a process for measuring the impact of culture behaviors training programs. Madam Chair, these are just a few passages of an important section of the report that speaks to trust. And often the reflex on the part of committees such as ours might be to recommend increased training. We need the granularity to figure out what kinds of training programs really are effective in changing the culture, how they're going to be received, how they're going to be evaluated. And this short intervention, Madam Chair, this is one issue that I wanted to put to the committee for consideration in the recommendations that we hopefully will have the time to elaborate on in some detail. I'll come back with further thoughts a bit later on, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Madame Sidhu, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is important for me to speak today. As a member of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, I know how serious the issue we are discussing here. Here's the main point. I believe we have to go above politics here and focus on survivors. I'm disappointed to see the politicization of this issue.
All right,
it's
stand.
So hurtful,
just a minute, please, Madame Sidhu. The interpreters are having a bit of trouble hearing you correctly. What would you like? If
Sure,
you
Madam
can raise your microphone, maybe up so it's beside your nose. Yeah, there you go. Let's give that. Go ahead and try that again, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, to giving me the opportunity. It is so important for me to speak today. As a member of the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, I know how serious this issue is we are discussing here today. Here's the main point. I believe we have to go above politics here and focus on survivors. I'm disappointed to see the politicization of this issue. It is so hurtful, Madam Chair. Since March, we have been conducting our own study on the same issue, the following up on another study that we conducted in 2019. So far, we have held 8 meetings and heard from 36 witnesses, including the Minister of Defense, Justice Deschamps, senior CF officials, and law enforcement, and over a dozen survivors of sexual assault from the military. These stories have been difficult to listen to, and thoughtfully commend all the survivors for coming forward. But having heard from the witnesses in FIVO, I agree we need to work with the witnesses, work with the survivors, not play politics. Madam Chair, let me be clear, the survivors need solutions, not politics. First, I want to focus on the solution, Madam Chair. I have been encouraged by the amount of political will shown by the government, including the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and my friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, who joined us in these meetings in FIVO, in their sincere commitment to reform the culture of the armed forces and to better support survivors. When the minister appeared on March 23rd, he acknowledged that the great deal of work that needs to be done. He said, I quote, "Sexual misconduct, harassment, and inappropriate behavior are not acceptable. We must call them out for what they are, an abuse of power. Such behavior is contrary to our values as Canadians and harmful to the Canadian Forces operational effectiveness. We want to prevent it. We want to be there for survivors and their support networks. We want to ensure that those who come forward feel safe, supported, and confident that they will be heard when they report sexual misconduct and harassment. There is obviously more work to be done, but the government has taken several key steps to ending sexual misconduct in the armed forces as part of Operation Honor. We have passed the Declaration of Victims' Rights, created the Sexual Misconduct Response Center, and it is implementing the path of dignity and respect, a strategy for long-term culture change to eliminate sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces. Following this, the Government of Canada has initiated an independent external comprehensive review led by former Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour. This review will look into harassment and sexual misconduct in the CAF, which will examine policies, procedures, programs, practices, and culture within the national defense and make recommendations for improvement. Eliminating all forms of misconduct and abuse of power and creating a safe work environment for everyone in the defense team has always been a top priority for me as a Minister of National Defense. However, recent media reports show that many members of the Canadian Armed Forces still do not feel safe to come forward. We know we must do more to make sure that every Canadian Armed Forces member feels safe to come forward and that we will be ready to support them when they do. We want on to say that in addition to resources like the Sexual Misconduct Response Center, chaplain services, military family resource centers, the employee assistance program, the family information line are critical to support those affected by sexual misconduct, but they are just part of our larger efforts to build a safe and inclusive workplace for all members of our defense team. We're working to eliminate the toxic masculinity that forms part of our military culture and keep us from moving forward. The outdated and toxic tradition that valorize toughness and aggression over emotional intelligence and cooperation and any part of our culture and contributes of bullying, harassment, and other inappropriate behaviors. In our committee, we made a conscious choice to keep the study survivor-centric. We recognized that we are not investigators, and it is not our place to risk interfering in investigations. The goal was not to look backward and find out who knew what and when. Although those questions have been repeatedly and clearly answered in this committee, as a legislative committee, the goal was to make recommendations that would improve conditions for women in the Canadian Armed Forces going forward. It was encouraging to hear the work that has already begun on this issue. When I asked Lieutenant General Wayne Iyer, it had been spoken directly to survivors in the short time since he became the acting chief of the defense staff. He said that many had reached out to him, that he has carefully listening to their stories. He said, quote, "One thing that is apparent to me is that we need to bring in some mechanism whereby survivors can achieve closure, perhaps where they do not necessarily want to follow a legal process." I'm very keen to learn more and see the wider retroactive engagement efforts as part of a final settlement coming, and perhaps as a learning opportunity to bring in some form of reconciliation process. There's much more to learn here. Madam Chair, once again, the issue we are discussing today is heartbreaking. We have to be asking questions, how can we help the survivors? From that I have heard from my colleagues today, these questions are being asked by some members on the committee. I encourage everyone to focus on survivor, culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Madame Sidhu. And then on to Mr. Baker and then Madame Vanderbilt. Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I wanted to thank Madame Sidhu who joined us today, and I think her subbing in was very timely because, as she pointed out, she was able to share with us some of the comments of some of the learnings that she's acquired and other members have acquired from her parliamentary work, from from the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and I think that that's very valuable and reminds us of why it's important to get to the report and focus our time on the report at this committee, which is why I believe the motion before us that we're debating at the moment needs to be withdrawn, but if not withdrawn, it needs to be defeated and voted against. I'm still hopeful it'll be withdrawn. So I think the focus here should be on victims. One of the things that Mr. Spengeman did, I thought, in his intervention was spoke about the Wakeston report and some of the findings from the Wakeston report that we can learn from and that we can apply to our report here. And so one of the people who came before us was Madame Deschamps, and Madame Deschamps has of course done a tremendous amount of work on the issue of sexual misconduct in the military, and issued a report several years ago. One of the things that in her report she writes about is underreporting, and I wanted to share with you some of the findings from that because they remind us of the kinds of things that we need to include in our report and why we need to the kinds of recommendations that we need to be prioritizing in our committee's report, and why we need to defeat this motion and why it needs to be withdrawn. She writes in her report, the CAF has until now failed to acknowledge the extent and pervasiveness of the problem of inappropriate sexual conduct. This may be the result of the very low number of complaints that are reported every year. In 2012, for example, a representative of the Canadian Armed Forces testified before the Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Status of Women that the Canadian Armed Forces harassment tracking system had recorded for the 10-year period beginning in 2002 only 31 complaints of sexual harassment, of which 11 were founded or partially founded. Further, as noted, the JAG reported that only 9 charges of sexual assault had been brought before court-martial in the year 2011-2012. These statistics do not, however, take into account the likelihood of underreporting and create a misleading picture of the problem. And this in turn has had the consequence of shifting attention in the Canadian Armed Forces away from the problem of inappropriate sexual conduct and its impact on the organization. Indeed, in releasing the results of the 2012 Canadian Forces Workplace Harassment Survey, the Director General of Military Personnel Research and Analysis recommended, quote, that attention be placed on addressing personal harassment and abuse of authority in the CAF, close quote, rather than on sexual harassment, given the low rate of sexual harassment reported in the survey. So here we have an example of where Madame Deschamps is writing about how senior leaders in the CAF have identified other issues, in this case, abuse of authority, rather than on sexual harassment. Rather, they see that as a priority over the issue of sexual harassment. And although the ERA was not asked to conduct surveys and obtain comparable data, the consistent evidence of inappropriate sexual conduct heard through the consultation strongly suggests that a much higher level of incidents occur, particularly of sexual harassment. The ERA can only conclude that there is a very serious problem of underreporting in the CAF. Indeed, the problem of underreporting was itself raised by numerous contributors, and as discussed in greater detail below, the ERA heard repeatedly through its consultations that victims of both sexual harassment and sexual assault failed to report such incidents for a variety of reasons. The failure to report both sexual harassment and sexual assault is not specific to the Canadian Armed Forces. It is well documented in other military organizations and more broadly in civilian life. And many of the reasons why CAF members are reluctant to report such incidents, however, appear to be connected to certain cultural norms, some of which have already been described. In particular, participants reported concerns about negative consequences for the complainant's career, loss of privacy and confidentiality, fear of collateral charges, and a deep skepticism that the chain of command would respond sensitively and appropriately to the complaint. Yet without information about what is occurring on the ground, the CAF is unable to make necessary changes to reduce inappropriate sexual conduct. Improving the rate of reporting is therefore crucial if senior leaders are to understand how policies are implemented and where they need to be improved. Underreporting is a reality that needs to be understood and addressed if a change of culture and reduction of incidents is to be achieved. So, you know, in this particular segment, Madame Deschamps obviously is writing about underreporting, and I think one of the things that I wanted to highlight out of this segment is when she writes about the reasons that victims don't report, and I just the words she uses, or she highlights that when she says participants reported concerns about negative consequences for the complainant's career, loss of privacy and confidentiality, fear of collateral damages, and deep skepticism. The chain of command would respond sensitively and appropriately to the complaint. So here we have one of the challenges, and this is not the first time we've heard about this at this committee during the study, is how we have to make sure that that there's a process that is that allows and trust is built up to ensure that victims, that complainants can bring forward those allegations and not face some of these negative consequences. I think this is one of the things that we've heard about at committee, and I highlighted here because I think it's important that we need to be able to tackle this. This is one of the problems that we need to be able to tackle to address sexual harassment and assault in the armed forces. And that's why I believe this motion needs to be withdrawn, because what it does is it focuses our attention on more of the political game playing instead of tackling some of the problems that need to be tackled to address this problem, like the one I just highlighted, which is underreporting, and Madame Deschamps and in her report wrote about extensively. Another thing I wanted to bring to the committee's attention was further testimony from FEWO, from the Committee on the Status of Women. There was a question to a witness named Julie Lalonde, who was asked about PTSD among MST survivors, and Julie Lalonde says, "I can tell you that the highest rate of post-traumatic stress disorder worldwide is among victims of rape and sexual violence. The second highest rate is in the military. We urgently need to take this seriously. Trauma shouldn't be organized into a hierarchy. When their trauma isn't considered equivalent to the trauma caused by war, victims of sexual violence don't receive the support they deserve. That's unacceptable." So I highlight this because, when I hear stories like this, or testimony, I should say, like this, it's a reminder of how much is at stake in this study. And when you hear about the rates of PTSD among victims of rape and sexual violence, how can we not focus our attention on that? Like, there's people there's Canadians, there's members of the armed forces who've served our country, who are serving our country, who are struggling with this. Some of them, I presume, are following this committee. Some of them may be watching today. Like, how do we defend passing this motion and then spending the next 5 weeks or whatever it is, most of the next 5 weeks, playing for further political games and calling witnesses again to answer questions we've already heard the answers to, score political points, to grab a headline, when this is happening? Like, it's happening on our watch, and I think we can contribute to solving it. So I wanted to highlight that testimony as a reminder of what's at stake. Another piece of testimony that I think is relevant to hear is, we heard from Mr. Okros. Mr. Okros came to this committee, but he also presented to the committee on the status of women, and he was asked a question about the urgency of taking action. And he says, "This is urgent. We have people who are still hurting. We have members internally within the military. And it's been stated that they have lost trust, that needs to be rebuilt with urgency. But Canadians need to have confidence in their military, need to have confidence that when particularly young women, young men, and people of diverse identities choose to serve Canada in uniform, that they're going to be treated with respect, and they're going to have good, full, meaningful career. That needs to be something that needs to be communicated effectively." So, Mr. Okros, who we all heard from, who during this study, so we all know, and we know his credentials, speaks about, we have people who are hurting. We have members internally within the military hurting. So these folks are hurting. I don't know. To me, folks, like to my colleagues on this committee, Canadians are hurting. Members of the armed forces are hurting. We're hearing this from victims like Christine Wood, who I spoke about earlier, but we're hearing from experts like Mr. Okros. He's not alone. And they're hurting, and we're not going to dedicate our time to relieve that hurt. Like I don't know how to even explain that to someone, how we're not going to do that. Like, why wouldn't we do what we could? Why would we contribute to that outcome to help relieve the pain that people are feeling? He goes on to say, it's been stated that they have lost trust. That needs to be rebuilt with urgency. And we've heard on the issue of trust, we've heard extensively, not just from Mr. Okros, but from others, how many have lost trust. I think virtually every member of this committee has spoken to that issue here, other members of the forces, certainly those people who are victims and want to bring forward allegations have lost trust. And so let's start doing the things, let's put in place the processes to rebuild that trust. And that's not something that happens overnight, but Mr. Okros talking about how this has to be done with urgency. We've heard that from him. We're hearing that from others. Like, to my colleagues on the committee, why wouldn't we show that urgency? Like we as far as elected officials go, certainly in this parliament, like we know more about the issue of sexual harassment and sexual assault in the Canadian Armed Forces than I would suspect most elected officials. Certainly we're among the most knowledgeable amongst the elected officials in this parliament and probably prior parliament. And so we're looked to show leadership on this. It's urgent. It's urgent to rebuild that trust. And this motion basically says we're going to set solving this problem aside to be able to call witnesses we've called before and ask questions we've asked before, to hear answers we've heard before. Really? I mean, let's respond to these calls for action, these calls for urgent action. And I get that, this committee isn't going to solve this alone, but this committee is here to contribute. And if we can even contribute a little bit, that's worth it. That's worth it. Anyway, I'll go on to the next portion of what Mr. Okros said. The Canadians need to have confidence that when particularly young women, young men, and people of diverse identities choose to serve Canada in uniform, that they're going to be treated with respect, and they're going to have a good, full, meaningful career. So, like when I think about Canada, I think about when I think about Canada, I think one of the things I think about that's great about Canada is that diversity. People of different backgrounds, different expertise, different ages, and the Canadian Armed Forces, and we've heard this, and I think all members of this committee would agree that that's ensuring that the Canadian Armed Forces can attract people of diverse backgrounds, men and women of diverse backgrounds, expertise, points of view, different parts of Canada, is really vital to making sure that we have a strong armed forces. But because you need to have the best and the brightest, and only by attracting folks from all corners of society can you do that. So we've heard that, and I think most members of the committee would agree with that. But I think what strikes me mostly about that testimony about the need to be able to attract and retain young women, young men, people of diverse identities, is the fact that Canada is so diverse, and that's one of our strengths. And the current situation, the problem that we have yet to solve around how members of the forces are treated around sexual assault, sexual misconduct of any kind is preventing that from happening. So by not acting on this, by not acting on these warnings from Mr. Okros and others, by not attracting that diversity, we're not going to have the strongest armed forces we could have. And so in this committee, therefore, by not acting on that, by prioritizing its time on political game playing, which is proposed in this motion, basically, or this motion proposes that we spend all our time on things that lead to politics and finger pointing rather than actually writing the report, which is how we make a difference, is taking away from an opportunity to strengthen the Canadian Armed Forces, from the very armed forces that we laud, that we talk about needs to be strengthened. And so I just think it's too bad that this motion is before us, was introduced, and I urge the members of the committee to withdraw this motion. And if the person who introduced, the member who introduced it, if Mr. Bazan's not going to withdraw it, then I'd urge the members of this committee to vote against it. Earlier tantôt, je vous ai lu le témoignage de.
Earlier, I read Miss Christine Wood's testimony earlier. She testified before another committee, and I also wanted to read another piece of testimony, which is very important, I think. It's not very long. Sorry. It's from Emily Tulloch. I hope I'm using the right word in French. Survivante, a survivor, as we say in English. I entered the Canadian Armed Forces in 1998. Since then, I have been a victim of sexual misconduct. I'm here today to tell you that I was raped just 1 month after the beginning of my basic training in Saint-Jean. I was also sexually assaulted in Borden during my training. I was fondled, kissed, against my will during certain activities. This degrading behavior is more widespread than you think. To top it all off, I endured misogynistic and sexist comments throughout my career. I was told that I was only accepted because I'm a girl. One instructor in Borden told me this, looking at me straight in the eyes. If your dad did everything for you in your cushy little life, tell us, and we can help you out. I believe in the importance of the Army. I hope to continue my career and serve my country to the best of my ability. However, my experience of the military justice system has been rather negative. I have a lot of questions about how the military police should investigate. I had 3 interviews with the military police since I reported misconduct. 2 of these encounters were atrocious and felt like interrogations to me. During these interviews, I got the impression that the investigators did not treat me as a human being. I was just another file in their eyes. They didn't have any empathy or compassion. It was so frustrating that I left before the end of the second meeting. I got the impression that I was not being heard and that I was being treated as a criminal. Nobody should be subjected to this kind of treatment when they're so vulnerable and need help. The military police must improve its training when it comes to questioning victims of sexual assault. There needs to be a course to teach them that victims need understanding and empathy. If there's already such a course, we have to get rid of it and start from scratch. I also believe that the interview should be held by an officer of the same sex as the victim. In my case, it was only halfway through the interview that it was proposed that I speak to a woman officer when I started to cry. Here again, the military police said that the meeting would have to be postponed to the following week because no female officer was available. During basic training, those in charge tend to give fundamental values to recruit, that is, duty, loyalty, integrity, and courage. This is taught through PowerPoint presentations and exercise books. These values just go through the safety net. This has been what has perpetuated this toxic culture. Military authorities have not been able to apply ethical standards that are very high when it comes to integrity. If the heads are not able to respect the fundamental values and serve as an example, how can we expect that the majority of soldiers will do so? And during basic training, I was shown a cartoon that oversimplified the concept of consent. To my mind, this video is ridiculous. It's amusing, but the subject of sexual misconduct is not funny. It should make recruits uncomfortable enough that they should realize that this is a problem. I'm sharing this testimony because the words touch me a great deal, and I think that it's a good reminder to see how we need to help people like this, like Ms. Tulloch, who had the courage to testify before a parliamentary committee and tell her story. And describe how she was treated and how her colleagues suffer. She said, and I'll read this sentence, "I entered the Canadian Armed Forces in July 2018, and I get the impression that I experienced a whole lifetime of aggression and sexual misconduct. Couldn't we help Ms. Tulloch? Or at least try to help Ms. Tulloch? Instead of spending the next 5 weeks asking to see witnesses we've already met with and ask them the same questions and hear the same answers. With the objective of criticizing one or the other political party. Really? Is that our priority? When we hear this kind of testimony here? Testimony where somebody says, I'm here today to tell you that I was raped just 1 month after the beginning of my basic training in Saint-Jean? Is that our response? It can't be. I can't believe this. Let's concentrate on the problem here. The problem is the problem Christine Wood presented and whose testimony I read you today, and Emily Tulloch's testimony. That's the problem. That is the problem that we should solve. And to solve that problem, we need to write a report and present to Canadians what we've concluded, I think in the past 4 months. I don't remember exactly when we started, but it's been months. We've been working on this for months. That's what we should be doing. That's why we're members of Parliament, to help people. to help our constituents. What are we going to say to Ms. Tulloch and Ms. Wood? What are we going to tell them after 5 weeks? Well, we spent another 5 weeks playing politics, and we spent a little bit of time creating a report. Is that our priority? We should be leaders on this issue. We are the most knowledgeable members on this topic in Parliament. We've spent 4 months working on this. I simply can't believe that we're even discussing a motion which will not help people like Ms. Tulloch and Ms. Wood and make them a priority. I don't understand. I'm begging you, members of the committee, I urge you to vote against this motion and support the victims who work on the issue that is before us. The issue is not what one public servant said to another one, and hear this for the 10th or 20th time, hear from the same people. That is not how we're going to solve the problem affecting Ms. Tulloch or Ms. Wood. It's by working together at a meeting and drafting a report. So I'm begging you, please listen to this testimony and think about these people and vote against this motion. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much. On to you, Madame Vandenbeld.
Very much, Madam Chair. And I really do appreciate a number of my colleagues' interventions. Particularly, I can see the authenticity and the emotion. And I'm very pleased that we had Ms. Sidhu join us, who has sat in on many of the hearings that were in the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, where we heard, and I had the privilege of subbing into those, we heard some of the very heart-wrenching testimony from the survivors. And so a couple of things that I'd like to say about the motion that is before us, and then I'd like to continue a little bit along the vein of some of my colleagues. I'm looking at this motion from the perspective of somebody who has been affected and impacted by sexual trauma, sexual misconduct, violence, harassment in the military. And I can't imagine, I have no way myself of knowing, and I know that every person is different, and it's not a homogenous group. And I know that, I'm not speaking for any of the survivors, but I do think that in general, when looking at what we can do as parliamentarians.
All right.
And
I'm sorry to interrupt, Madame Vandenbeld, but the clerk just brought to my attention that 6 o'clock, and we lose our House resources at 6 o'clock. So, anyway, motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
Let's have that. I don't think that Mr. Bazan wanted. He wanted to get his motion voted upon, and I might also correct the record that it was Ms. Vanderbilt in a previous meeting who set the the date of May 28th as being the deadline for this, and I believe it was meeting 24. So that was alleged to have happened. Somebody accused the Conservatives of doing that, but what that was actually the parliamentary secretary, the extension of the executive.
I do recall that was the vote and will of the committee, but I'm concerned about the lack of resources. If the interpreters are leaving, I don't know that, Madam Chair, I think it needs to be your call, Madam Chair.
Right. Was anyone else wanted to speak to this?